I still remember the first time I saw a sea turtle haul herself out of the ocean. It was just after midnight, early in the nesting season of 2015, and I had only recently arrived at the coastal marine reserve where I now live and work. Back then, our beaches were silent most nights, the sand undisturbed save for the crabs and wind. But that night, as the moonlight shimmered across the water, I saw her, a green sea turtle, larger than I'd imagined, heaving herself slowly up the beach. That image stayed with me for years, and little did I know it would mark the beginning of one of the most remarkable chapters in sea turtle conservation in this part of the world. My name is Dr. Carla Mendez. I'm a veterinarian with a background in marine wildlife rehabilitation, and for the past decade, I've worked at a marine reserve on the southern Atlantic coast of Brazil. Our reserve covers about 12 kilometers of shoreline, with gently sloping dunes, coastal scrub, and a narrow belt of mangroves that serve as both nursery and barrier. This place is home to endangered species like the hawksbill and loggerhead turtles, both of which had seen their populations plummet over decades due to coastal development, fishing bycatch, and pollution. In the early 2000s, sea turtle nesting along our stretch of coastline had become depressingly rare. On some beaches, fewer than a dozen nests were recorded per year. Poaching of eggs was common, and hatchlings rarely made it to the water. But in 2010, after years of pressure from conservationists and local communities, our state government established the Reserva Marina das Dunas do Sul, a federally recognized marine reserve. That was the turning point. We began by installing protective measures, low-impact fences to deter predators, night patrols during the nesting season, and public education campaigns in nearby fishing villages. The local fishers were skeptical at first. I remember visiting schools and community centers with diagrams of turtle life cycles and pictures of nesting events from other regions. We talked about the connection between turtle populations and healthy oceans, about how turtles help control jellyfish blooms and maintain seagrass beds, which in turn support local fish stocks. Slowly, the attitudes began to shift. The real change, though, came from the people. A few brave women from the coastal town of Pedra Alta started walking the beaches at dawn, checking for tracks. They documented the first nests using old notebooks and, eventually, GPS units we provided. We trained them in hatchling care, taught them how to relocate vulnerable nests to safer areas, and invited their children to release the baby turtles into the surf. By 2018, we were recording around 50 nests per season. It was encouraging but still precarious. A single oil spill or violent storm could set us back years. But we held on. Then came the season of 2022, the one none of us could have predicted. It began with a small sign. On the morning of October 14th, our patrol team found 5 nests along a stretch of beach that hadn't seen turtle activity in over a decade. I examined the tracks myself, long, deep grooves flanked by drag marks where the turtles' flippers had pushed against the sand. Each nest was fresh. We marked them with biodegradable stakes and installed a motion-sensitive camera nearby. That week, we found 12 more. We didn't want to raise false hopes. Sometimes, turtles nest in bursts, clusters driven by weather or currents. But as the weeks passed, the numbers only increased. By mid-November, we had counted over 200 nests. What made this even more astonishing was the diversity. Not only were green turtles returning, but we recorded hawksbill, olive ridley, and even a few loggerhead nests, all species categorized as endangered or vulnerable. At night, we began rotating shifts, walking the beach under the moon with only red light headlamps to avoid disturbing the turtles. I saw things I will never forget. One evening, just past midnight, I stood beside a nesting hawksbill turtle as she laid her eggs. Her shell was scarred, likely from an old fishing net, but her movements were focused, ancient, methodical. She had traveled hundreds, possibly thousands of kilometers to reach this beach. She had returned, likely to the very place she was born. Our patrols became part of a nightly ritual. Volunteers, students, and even retired fishermen joined in. They walked silently, watching for the silhouettes of turtles emerging from the waves. The sound of the ocean, the smell of the salt, the crunch of sand underfoot, everything seemed heightened in those moments. And still, the nests kept coming. By December 1st, our team had documented 378 nests, a number we hadn't dared to dream of. Hatchlings began to emerge in waves, spilling down the dunes toward the sea like small, determined shadows. We ran out of crates to protect them during release. Children from the nearby communities took turns giving names to some of the baby turtles. Esperanza, Hope, Luz, Light, Guerrera, Warrior. These weren't just animals to them anymore, they were symbols. As a veterinarian, I spent my days monitoring hatchling health, collecting genetic samples, and treating injuries. A few nests were lost to storms, but our survival rates were some of the best on record. Roughly 85% of the hatchlings made it to the water, thanks to our relocation strategies and the tireless work of the community patrols. When the national press caught wind of what was happening, they called it a miracle. And in some ways, it was. But I knew better. This was not the work of chance or divine fortune. It was the result of 12 years of patient, often invisible labor. Of meetings held under tin roofs. Of trust slowly built between scientists and communities who had every reason to be skeptical. The climax of the season came in early January, when we reached a total of 523 nests, a record not only for our reserve, but for the entire region. We were witnessing the beginning of a population recovery, the fruits of a model of conservation that put local people at its heart. But as we would soon learn, protecting these turtles was not only about getting them to the sea. The real battle, ensuring they lived to return in 20 or 30 years to nest again, was only just beginning. After the last hatchlings of the 2022 season scurried into the Atlantic under the early January moonlight, there was a brief and almost surreal calm. The beaches, so alive for weeks with nesting activity and community patrols, were quiet again. But none of us felt that it was over. In many ways, the hardest part was just beginning. Turtles don't stay long in the places where they hatch. From the moment they enter the ocean, they begin what researchers call the lost years, a mysterious, long-distance drift through the open sea. Only a fraction of them survive. Our job now was to ensure that the ones who did had a world to return to. We began by improving our ability to track their journeys. In early 2023, with support from the Brazilian Institute of Biodiversity and a partnership with an international NGO, we began tagging juvenile turtles using lightweight satellite transmitters. It took time, training, and gentle hands. These animals are delicate when young, and attaching a tag to their shells without disrupting their growth or hydrodynamics is a careful process. I remember the first turtle we tagged that season. She was a green turtle, about 15 centimeters long, small enough to fit in both my hands. We named her Luna and released her in the early morning while the water was still calm. A week later, we picked up her signal hundreds of kilometers offshore, drifting with the Brazil current. It was the first time we had hard data showing that our hatchlings were reaching the pelagic zones where they feed and grow. That same year, we fitted larger transmitters on adult nesting females, including several who had returned to our beaches multiple times. One of them, a loggerhead we called Vovo, Grandma, took us by surprise. After nesting in early December, she didn't head east into open water as expected. Instead, she swam north along the coast and stopped for nearly 3 weeks in a known feeding area near the mouth of the São Francisco River. That area was just outside a heavily fished zone. We alerted the local authorities and used her data to argue for a temporary no-fishing buffer there. It was our first direct success in using turtle movement data to influence ocean policy. Meanwhile, our work on land was expanding. In the fishing communities of Pedra Alta and Barreiras, we began holding workshops on sustainable fishing practices. With help from marine ecologists and social scientists, we introduced net modifications that reduced turtle bycatch, simple changes like LED lights on gill nets, which dramatically cut the number of accidental turtle captures at night. These weren't just top-down decisions. We listened. Fishers told us when the lights interfered with target species. They helped us tweak the brightness and positioning. We offered small grants to test out new gear. And when a fisher named Antonio brought us a live juvenile hawksbill caught in his net, and stayed while we treated and released it, others took notice. There was still skepticism, but now there was also pride. By 2024, the data were undeniable. The 523 nests of the 2022 season had been no fluke. That year, we recorded 498 nests, a slight dip but well within the natural variation. And crucially, the survival rates continued to improve. Predation of nests by feral dogs and foxes dropped by over 60% thanks to the community-run deterrent programs and fencing improvements. Fewer nests needed to be relocated, more beaches had become safe again. But we were not immune to setbacks. In March of that year, an offshore oil platform suffered a leak. The spill didn't hit us directly, but tar balls began washing up just north of the reserve. We activated our emergency response plan, contacting rescue networks and preparing rehabilitation tanks at our veterinary center. In the end, we treated 17 turtles, mostly juveniles and subadults. 6 were too sick to save. One of them was a tagged hawksbull named Cora, who had nested with us 2 seasons in a row. I remember scrubbing the oil from her carapace with a toothbrush and saline solution, her eyes glazed but breathing steady. She died 3 days later from internal toxicity. It was a gut punch. For the community, too. Children who had released Cora's hatchlings cried at the news. But it also lit a fire. Local youth groups organized a beach cleanup campaign that covered over 20 kilometers of coastline. Residents from 3 towns showed up with gloves and buckets. Some of the same kids who had once collected turtle eggs to sell were now running workshops on plastic pollution. Conservation was no longer something we brought to them. It had become something they claimed for themselves. Perhaps the clearest sign of this came in June 2024, when the Pedra Alta School Board voted to incorporate a marine ecology module into their 8th grade science curriculum, built entirely around our reserve. Students now learn to identify turtle species, track migration patterns using real data from our transmitters, and even spend weekends assisting with nest monitoring. I teach one of those classes once a month. Every time, I tell them the same thing. None of this was guaranteed. Every turtle that comes back to this beach does so because of choices we made, and continue to make. We've come to understand that true conservation doesn't stop at the shoreline. It requires connections between people, across borders, between science and tradition, between what we protect today and what will return in 30 years. In February 2025, we celebrated our 3rd consecutive season with over 500 nests. But that number, to me, is not just a metric. It's a promise, a signal that our model, one grounded in patience, partnership, and science, is working. And yet, the threats continue to evolve: illegal development, warming seas, shifting currents, offshore drilling. We must stay ready. As I write this, another nesting season is approaching. The patrol teams are preparing their gear. The hatchery boxes are cleaned. The GPS trackers are charged. And just last week, a young girl from Pedra Alta, only 11 years old, asked me if turtles dream when they're swimming. I smiled. Maybe not like we do, I said. But I think they remember where they came from. And they never stop trying to find their way back. This is the real miracle of sea turtle nesting. Not just the return of the turtles, but the return of care, of community, of connection, of commitment.